Could everybody take their seats? We're going to get started now. And if you could put all of your personal devices on stun, we would appreciate that. Thank you. So good evening, everybody. My name is Val Asdens. I'm the Planning Director for Howard County. And I want to welcome you to tonight's Master Plan Information Meeting. Just to avoid any confusion, tonight's meeting is an information meeting, second time said. And we're going to be covering what's been accomplished so far to date on the Ellicott City Master Plan. We'll also present the county's 5-year flood mitigation plan, which is part of the master plan's near-term strategies, basically implementation items for the plan, and then we'll discuss next steps. We'll conclude with an opportunity for everybody to ask questions and get answers from the resources, our consultants, staff, so hopefully we can answer all of your questions this evening. Just a reminder, this is an information meeting, and it's unlike the master plan meetings that many of you may have attended, where information was presented by the consultant team, and then you had an opportunity to meet in small groups and discuss a way forward for Ellicott City. It's not the format for tonight's meeting. Also, it's not the public hearing that the County Council will be holding on September 17th. At that point, testimony will be taken on the funding bill for Ellicott City improvements. And you can sign up for that meeting to testify on the County Council's website. So tonight's meeting is also being live streamed and recorded, so please tell any of your friends or anybody who did not have an opportunity to attend that this meeting will be uploaded to the county's website next week, and we'll be posting the PowerPoint presentation that you'll see this evening on our website tomorrow. So tonight we're restarting and continuing work on the master plan for Ellicott City and its watershed. As many of you know, we began that process shortly after the 2016 flood. And just show of hands, how many of you have participated in those meetings so far? Okay, so pretty educated crowd. Thank you. Well, first, I just want to welcome John Weinstein. Councilman Weinstein will be making some opening remarks, but before we do that, I want to share a video with you from County Executive Alan Kittleman.
Good evening, and thanks for taking the time to be a part of this meeting as we continue to work on the master plan for Ellicott City and its watershed. In 4 years, Ellicott City will mark its 250th anniversary. Ellicott City means so much to Howard County. Many of us have deep connections to this community. We watched in shock and sadness as our town was devastated by 2 catastrophic storms in less than 2 years. When I asked DPZ to embark on the master plan, I asked that the plan take a fresh and creative look at long-term flood mitigation strategies, land use, downtown parking, business and retail marketing strategies, urban design and placemaking, and transportation. Tonight, you will get a recap of the master plan as it stood prior to May 27th. You also hear an overview of our 5-year flood mitigation strategy. That strategy, announced last month, will be folded into the longer-term master plan. It will serve as a near-term action plan to ensure that Ellicott City celebrates its 250th milestone. These near-term recommendations are difficult but necessary decisions to make Ellicott City even more resilient and better than before. I'm certain that years down the road, people will look back and say, that community fixed it. They got it right. I look forward to working with you on this roadmap to make Ellicott City safe, resilient, viable, and vibrant during its next 250 years.
So with that, I'd like to introduce Councilman John Weinstein.
Thanks, Al. Good evening, folks. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, so I've never been accused of being soft-spoken. So thank you all for coming out. We have, as Val said, a presentation from folks who've been intimately involved with the work these past couple of years. Well, in one case at least, Mr. Luca, who's been involved, I won't give away how many years you've been working on things of this nature, but many years here in the county. And so this is an opportunity to continue the work of the master plan, which had virtually been complete right before the May 2018 flood. And so we're restarting that process, continuing that process, and then including in it, again tonight, a conversation about the 5-year plan. So again, by show of hands, how many people were here or watched the recording of the presentation by some of these folks from last Tuesday before the county council. Okay. All right. Well, the slides you'll see, it's a bit of a subset. So the good news, it won't be 2 hours like the last time. And it's a subset. There are a couple of additional slides in here, I think, that, again, that make a relationship back to the master plan. So I look forward to sharing this information and having an opportunity to answer some questions. We do have a limit on our time here in the room in the recording that we're doing. It's being live streamed and also closed caption. I do want to recognize as well Delegate Bob Flanagan just joined us. Bob's been working closely with me, the county, and the county executive and the state to address the issues that have been facing Ellicott City for the 4 years he's been in office, and particularly in response to the flood. So thank you very much for being here, and look forward to the conversation tonight.
Thanks, John. So let me start by giving you some background on what's been to date a very transparent planning process. So in 2016, the county held a series of community meetings following the devastating 2016 flood. And those discussions then transitioned into developing a master plan for Ellicott City. Simply put, a master plan is a tool that helps guide decisions about a community's future. When adopted, the Ellicott City master plan will be folded into the Howard County General Plan, which broadly helps guide decisions for the county's future. So in May 2017, the county hired Mahan Reichel and their team to help us prepare a master plan. We also formed an 11-member Citizens Planning Advisory team that included residents, business and property owners, and community leaders. And I think they've been a great help to the county, and they've been a great sounding board as the plan has been developing. They've also done an outstanding job in reaching out and promoting this effort with their neighbors, community groups, and social networks. We look forward to their continued input when we have yet another meeting in October of this year. To date, we've had a total of 9 public master plan meetings. That includes 5 community meetings. We've had 4 of the public master plan advisory team meetings. Our consultants held a pop-up event in 2016 on Main Street as part of the Music Fest. We've had dozens and dozens of individual meetings with stakeholders and property owners and others. And tonight's meeting marks the 10th public master plan meeting, and we'll be back, as I mentioned, in October. This meeting, as John had mentioned, is the formal restart of the master plan process for Ellicott City that stalled after the May 27, 2018 flood. This spring, the county had been working with our consultant team on a draft plan, and it was on the verge of being released to the public for a comment and input, and then came May 27th. While the purpose of this master plan remains as relevant as ever, our consultants are in the process of developing and testing new concepts guided by today's realities. Those will be presented and discussed in detail to you in October, and that will also include a detailed discussion of the county's 5-year flood mitigation plan. So tonight what you'll get is a recap of the planning process, where we've been. You'll learn about the county's 5-year flood mitigation plan, and that plan includes near-term projects that will be a key part of the master plan's implementation strategy. I also want to re-welcome Tom McGilloway, a former colleague of mine actually from Mahan Reichel. Phil Nichols is here from the county administration, Mark DeLuca from the Department of Public Works, and Chris Brooks from McCormick Taylor, who is the county's engineering consultant. And we also have Ryan Miller from the Office of Emergency Management. He'll also be speaking. So they'll be presenting information about the master plan and the 5-year flood mitigation plan. Tom is going to first recap the master plan process, where we've been, where we are. Phil, Mark, and Chris will then go over the 5-year mitigation plan, and Tom will then describe next steps. And we'll close with about 30 minutes of questions and answers from the audience. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom.
Great. Thank you, Val, and good evening. So we'll be highlighting, as Val said, where we left off. Our last public meeting for the master plan was in late March, and so there's been a big gap at the time, so we want to refresh and recap where we've been. So when we were retained in May of 2017, we were really charged with delivering a master plan that not only encompassed the downtown area, but the watershed, the Ellicott City watershed, and then also looked at how flood mitigation strategies could also achieve multiple objectives for the town, some that you've heard from the county executive in his video. We started the plan, the master plan process in this room. It was part of a combined meeting with Chris Brooks's presentation of the hydraulic and hydrology study on the H&H study. And I think for those of you that were at that meeting, you'll recall that the master plan is really building on a number of prior efforts and reports. So it wasn't starting from a blank slate. A couple most notable are the work from the Flood Work Group report from 2015, and then also the substantial community input from the Community Assistance Community Advisory Group process, or CAG process, in 2016 that occurred after the floods of July 2016. And a really significant part of our master planning effort that's been informing it has been McCormick Taylor's H&H study that they presented at that time. We can't stress enough the importance of that H&H study in our work and the model that it is created out of that study. It's really served as a baseline for our master plan. For those of you involved in the meetings, you've seen a number of scenarios we presented. We've had a great relationship with McCormick Taylor, working back and forth, testing ideas, and running models and seeing what works effectively and what doesn't. It's important to note that out of the H&H study, there were a number of projects identified that Chris will highlight again in his presentation. But we had to use the master plan process to really examine those, which would be the most effective, when in achieving multiple goals for the plan. And some of those considerations that we took into account were the constructability, the cost, the complexity of not only permitting and constructing, and then also the time involved in implementing those. So, and then a number of those recommendations, or the potential projects identified in the H&H study really had a limited ability to achieve multiple objectives. While they achieved some flood mitigation objectives, they wouldn't allow necessarily for accommodating some of the other objectives of the master plan. So that was really the focus of some of our work as we worked with the H&H study and the master plan. And also left, and as you knew in March in our presentations, we still were challenged with a number of challenges on the lower Main area, while we were able to achieve a number of objectives in upper Main. So the process, as Val said, I'm not going to go over the detail of the number of meetings that we've had. We've had a number of meetings. We were at, it was a 4-part process. We were at the light blue phase, the draft stage. We had shared in March a number of scenarios, and we were in the process of refining those scenarios so that we could put them into the draft plan and present them for public review. And that's when the May storm hit. But in that process, where we left off in March, we had identified a vision and also a number of objectives that are still relevant today. The vision, as a recap, is Ellicott City and its watershed as a model resilient community that thrives by protecting its people, commerce, history, culture, and natural environment. And this is still relevant today. This vision is informed by 4 master plan objectives that were really developed as the 4 pillars out of the CAG process prior to the beginning of the master plan process. And they include rebuilding, environmental, preservation, and economy. So our intent has been to seek flood mitigation strategies that could advance all 4 of these objectives. The study area, as I indicated earlier, is the entire watershed. And as we began looking at background information and studies that had been done, we quickly learned that much of the watershed was built out with limited physical space to make significant changes. Much of the development in the watershed took place before current stormwater management regulations were in place. In 1990, the 100-year quantity management became a requirement. And at that time, by January 1st of 1991, 59% of the residential units in the watershed were already built. In 2000, the Maryland Department of Environment modified stormwater design requirements with additional emphasis on water quality. And by the end of 2000, 76% of the residential in the watershed were already built. So as we examined a lot of studies and background reports and some of this existing information, we quickly honed into focusing on minimizing constrictions and improving conveyance, primarily in the core of the downtown, the area that's highlighted with the rectangle, the west end, and the downtown core. As we move into more of the downtown core, this diagram highlights some of those constrictions and areas where conveyance has been difficult and that we've been trying to improve in the master plan. We also learned from information that the existing conveyance system cannot carry a 10-year storm, let alone a 100-year storm. So a big focus on the master plan was how to remove some of those constrictions and improve conveyance. The red asterisks that you see highlight some of those main constriction points from Ellicott Mills Drive, quite a few at Court Avenue, Lot E, under Main Street at the arch culvert under there, and in Lot D. And then the blue arrows indicate where water was jumping the channel from those constrictions and flowing down Main Street. So a focus of ours has been how do we keep water in the channel and not flowing out of the channel during major storm events. And then Lower Main, where all of the tributaries converge, the blue circles highlight where all those convergence happens and where we have particular challenges. In fact, McCormick Taylor helped illustrate this in their H&H study and their presentation to show, to give an idea of the amount of water that needs to be conveyed. Lot F is about a 1 acre footprint, and with 800 acre feet of volume of water during the 2016 event, that would be equivalent of an 80-story building over 80-story building over Lot F with that 1 acre footprint. So that gives a kind of an idea of the volume of water that needs to be conveyed. So as we looked at this conveyance strategy, we looked at the different areas, and the whole corridor is not the same. And so we found that the greatest opportunity to improve conveyance was in the upper Main area, area number 2, pretty much from Old Columbia Pike up to Ellicott Mills Road. And that's an area where we could widen the stream channel. We had larger areas. We had the surface parking lots. They were most of the land involved was primarily publicly owned, and that gave us the ability to expand the channel the easiest without other constraints. For Lower Main and the West End, our biggest challenge, there weren't many opportunities to expand the channel, and our focus there has been on emphasizing flood-proofing. As we look at the upper Main conveyance, some of you may remember this diagram from our meetings, the area highlighted in green and actually the blue dashed line that goes under Ellicott Mills Road. The concept was to improve conveyance through this area, starting primarily with improved conveyance under Ellicott Mills Road and then passing from the behind the wine bin through Lot E and through Lot D. And then this, go to the next slide. And the construction of the Hudson Bend would require acquisition and removal of 2 buildings. This was the La Palapa restaurant that you see dashed in next to the Sukasa building, and then also the brewery annex building. We examined several model scenarios that did not remove those buildings, but it really was not effective without removing them. We looked at the brewery annex building as relocating that either elsewhere in Lot E or somewhere else in Ellicott City. And so it was important to note that before we reviewed these concepts, we met with the property owners of those two buildings to make sure they were comfortable in sharing these concepts with the public. And so we shared these concepts in March. One of the keys of removing a La Palapa in that business is having a place to relocate it before the removal of that building. So that's where we discussed some of the strategies of developing new retail space and parking structure in Lot D to accommodate that. Visually, and then we looked at some illustrative plans. It really creates an opportunity not only for flood mitigation, but to create a major amenity that achieves multiple objectives of improved open space, additional pedestrian access through the core of Main Street, and then leveraging additional investment opportunities. Because of the unique challenges with Ellicott City, this channel could take on several different cross sections, from a 30-foot wide straight wall that would be stone face cross section to what would happen in Lot D, which is the 80-foot width, where we would have several terraces and opportunity to create this as a real amenity space in the community. We shared several examples and images, and it's important to note that no one of these examples is exactly the situation that we could have here, but it represents some combination of techniques that could be achieved, from terraces to straight channel walls, and then also how to incorporate pedestrian access along the channel, and then also opportunities for some green where we could, and where that worked with some of the shear stress forces. It's important to note that prior to the May 27th flood, we had explored options for culverts under Lower Main. Lower Main continued to be a challenge for us. But one of the important things we did with the Hudson Bend, we wanted to make sure in the modeling that if we made improvements to Hudson Bend, it wasn't making the matters worse on Lower Main. The modeling indicated that it had a slight improvement. It really didn't make major improvements on Lower Main, but it didn't make it worse, and that allowed us to understand that some of those projects could happen independently. But we're still concerned with Lower Main. We explored culverts, parallel culverts under Main Street. It became quickly apparent that the constructability of those is a challenge, with not only the utilities underneath, but the need for the size of those culverts, needing to shore up the buildings, and then shutting down Main Street for possibly several years and disrupting business. And so that's where our focus on Lower Main and West End emphasized the flood proofing, recognizing that we were not making significant changes to the changes in the flooding for that part. And that brings us to where we are today. And with that recap, I'd like to introduce Ryan Miller with the County's Office of Emergency Manager to speak about the May 27th flood.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Ryan Miller, the Emergency Management Director for Howard County. Before going over the 5-year flood mitigation plan, let's take a moment to review the impacts of the May 27th storm. In that storm, we received about 7.5 inches of rain in just 5 hours, the majority of which fell in a 3-hour period. The storm came essentially in 2 waves, which was different than the 2016 storm, which largely came in 1 wave, and with each wave being worse than the one before. In a 6-hour period, starting at 4 p.m., the 911 center received over 1,000 calls for service. Multiple roads were washed away. You can see in the bottom right, that's Ellicott Mills Drive. We lost our old courthouse near Ellicott Mills. It was completely demolished. There were massive damage to streets, sidewalks, and buildings, and there were an untold number of swift water rescues not just on Main Street, but in the surrounding community as well. There was actually even a person in that courthouse when it collapsed that was rescued by a fire and rescue command officer who had just arrived on scene to take command of activities on northern Main Street when he'd just come from a fire, actually, a 2-alarm fire at Normandy Apartments. And he was pressed into service and rescued that person. There were numerous stories of heroism where community members rescued their neighbors or rescued strangers. A police officer lost his cruiser and nearly his life on Lower Main Street, assisting with evacuations. You'll see in the video that I'll show next that are clips from cameras from our very own Ron Peters. Thank you, Ron, for the video footage you've provided to us. But at the very end, you'll see firefighters carrying a shop owner to safety. It's an incredible story in and of itself that the clip gives us but only a glimpse. Thank you again, Ron, for providing us that video. I'd like to turn it over to Mark DeLuca from Department of Public Works.
Thanks, Ryan. So I wanted to just kick off the 5-year flood mitigation strategy. And the first slide I have is just by way of introduction for those people that aren't familiar with the watershed. What we have here is an outline of the Tiber-Hudson watershed. And it's actually made up of 3 tributaries, the Hudson, the Tiber, and the Ellicott branches. Each one of these is represented by a different color. So these are the sub-watersheds of the Tiber-Hudson watershed. So the green area that you see is the Hudson portion of the watershed. The red is the Tiber portion of the watershed, and the yellow is the Ellicott. And just to make sure that we're clear, so any drop of water that falls within the green area will find its way to the Tiber. A drop of water that finds its way to the red area finds its way to the to the Hudson, and a drop of water that goes into the red area falls into the Tiber, and likewise for the Ellicott. It's a very small watershed. It's 3.7 square miles, and but it's a very problematic one. In 2016, we had engaged again with McCormick Taylor to model the watershed for us and look at the 100-year storm on a 24-hour baseline, look at a 10-year storm and how the watershed and the system of tributaries reacts to a 10-year storm, and also to recreate the July 30th storm using the National Weather Service data, USGS, and even some YouTube videos. And as a result of that analysis, 18 projects were identified in their H&H study for an approximate cost of about $80 million. The interesting things about the 18 projects is what we were trying to store was 425 acre feet. Some of that above ground in stormwater retention ponds, some of that below ground, and some of that also, it doesn't store anything, but to improve the conveyance system through the watershed. And if you can remember from one of the slides that was previously shown, you think of Lot F as a 1 acre square, and so an acre foot is 1 foot of water on that 1 acre. So this is 425 feet of 425 feet of water, a column of water, 425 feet in the air on top of Lot F. So it was a tremendous amount of water that we were trying to deal with. So as a result of the first phase, we came up with 4 projects, and the recommended phase was about $18.5 million. And they were a combination. One retention facility on the Hudson, another retention facility, which we call Quaker Mill Retention Facility, and that's on Rogers Avenue. A conveyance improvement near the west end at 8600 Main Street, and the Tiber, a very large facility on the Tiber, which we're still in the process of studying. So that's where we are today, and what I'd like to bring Chris up now to talk a little bit more about the hydraulic modeling.
Thank you, Mark. So discuss a little bit about where we are with the hydraulic modeling that's supporting the master planning effort. We're going to talk about the before and after May 2018 storm event and how we refocused that. Talk about the elements of model iterations and how much goes into this. You're going to hear some variation of the word iteration or iterative a number of times in my portion of this discussion. And then how that led us to the results and the current alternatives that are supporting the 5-year plan. So back in May of last year, at the conclusion of the hydraulic presentation. I'm sorry? Yeah? Okay. Sure thing. We noted that the hydraulic model is a living model, and it's one that would be used as a jump-off point for the master planning effort, that we could continue to put ideas and different iterations of these ideas in to see what the results would be. So there are a number of variables involved. The first one, of course, is the depth of the flooding, which you can see represented here in our baseline map, which is the map before any of these improvements that Mark had just noted became part of the plan. Now, another variable is the velocity, because the depth of water, of course, leads to some damage, but it's really the velocity and the force associated with that that leads to the destruction in a lot of what we saw this past May in that event. Notably, once you get down towards the lower main area where you can see those yellow and red colors come up, that represents velocities 12 to over 20 feet per second in some places, which that's what's carrying the cars and other large pieces of debris and the tremendous force that does damage. So a notable area, of course, is the area around Kaplan's, where the water that's in the channel really had nowhere to go once it gets above a certain elevation, and then as it starts carrying a tremendous amount of force, breaking through the buildings at Kaplan's and the adjacent buildings. And of course, everyone has seen the videos or experienced it personally, what happened this past May, as far as what that water does. Because again, once it reaches a certain point, it's got riverbank on both sides, it's got a building above, it has nowhere else to go, and there's a tremendous amount of force associated with the velocity of that water coming through. So that's part of the variables that we look at here as part of our hydraulic modeling process. So back in the May of 2017, this was the map that we showed you, which indicated what the water surfaces would look like with the 18 projects and conveyance projects implemented, which again is a notable improvement in a number of areas relative to the baseline that you saw a few slides ago. But also down in Lower Main, we're still experiencing that 4 to 6 feet in the worst areas of depth going down through there, even with these 18 projects. And of course, some of those 18 projects, as Mark noted, underground management, which are very significant in cost and scope. So once we started working with the master plan team, we did look at a number of different things. Tom noted the culvert option under Lower Main Street that comes with considerable constructability and community impact issues was part of what we looked at. We also looked at the Hudson Bend as well, which is that expansion of the channel through the Court Avenue to Lot D area. You can see representation of that here. So we didn't just plug a single thing into the model relative to each of those. Every one of them came with a number of other variables associated with it in terms of what stormwater management options were occurring upstream to help lessen the quantity of water coming through. We looked at different storm events, and of course we're looking at all those different variables to see how the impacts are improved. This graph's just an example of a comparison of a number of different combinations of improvements and what they resulted in terms of water surface throughout Main Street itself. So after the May 2018 storm, the focus shifted a little bit. And we started looking at Lower Main in a different way and started plugging those options into our model at the direction of county officials to see what they would do to the water surfaces and particularly the velocities in Lower Main Street, because as we noted, that velocity is really part of what carries the destruction with it. So we looked at options that included additional channel and floodplain capacity from where the new cut meets with the Tiber Hudson down to the Patapsco River. We looked at different reconfigurations and removal of certain buildings through that stretch. And we also looked at Maryland Avenue, which is a pinch point for the water under the current arch culvert that goes through there, how we could increase capacity as well. Now, additionally, we looked at some options in the west end for smoothing out some of the sharp turns in the river and increasing the floodplain as well, relative to where that could be achieved with certain changes to properties there. So this chart's just an example. It was sort of a working chart that we had in the office for keeping track of all the different combinations of parameters that we had. Again, removing certain buildings and not others, different types of floodplain grading, different combinations of upstream stormwater management, including the Hudson Bend option, including the Maryland Avenue culverts, and then also looking at the height of the water in the Patapsco River, because ultimately how deep the water is in the Patapsco does impact how everything upstream works. And of course that can be highly variable, as we've seen during the two previous flooding events, as well as other events like Agnes and historical ones. So again, there's a lot of different combinations, and what we're looking to do is try to find that cost-benefit sweet spot in order to back up what the ultimate decisions are going forward. So again, it's iterative. You can see the model. It gives us a number of tools to work with. I just kind of included some examples here with the floodplain grading option, where we could look at where's the water actually going into the channel from the roadway versus coming out of the channel going into the roadway. That's important to note. And we looked at several different options of that to try to optimize the best one. So these are some of the options which were looked at holistically. The first one being, if we were to open the first floor along the south side of Main Street, basically the historic buildings would retain the second floor on piers. We saw some incremental improvement in flooding there, but also noted that the piers create a tremendous opportunity for catching debris and blocking the flow of the channel as well. So there were definite concerns with that. Another option that was iterated was to remove the portions of the buildings which are over the channel only. So the facade or the front portion of the building would be maintained, while the area over the stream would be open, allowing that water to go up a little bit more without obstruction. As you can see over the baseline, some incremental improvement, but still significant depth in the purple there on Main Street. This option was removing the buildings, but also not really doing anything to the channel, just taking the buildings out as obstructions. And again, we continue to iterate through this with this option with different parameters. We looked at different floodplains, different things upstream, and then arrived at a selected alternative. So what you see on the screen in terms of the hydraulic model reflects the option which is supporting the current 5-year plan. where buildings along the south side of Maine have been removed, and that area has been utilized to create additional floodplain, which creates additional capacity for the flow through that area. It also includes certain stormwater management improvements, notably the Hudson 7 and Quaker Mill ponds. It includes additional culverts under Maryland Avenue in order to increase the capacity of that pinch point, and as well as the Hudson Bend improvements, which will serve to have less water coming down Main Street into this area and keep more water into the channel. Additional to this option, in terms of what we modeled, included the new Ellicott Mills culvert and also some changes to the west end grading, though that's not shown here. So again, this modeling effort it's very iterative. It's done in conjunction with the rest of the team to try to find the optimum sweet spot of cost, benefit, and impact to the community. And we're going to continue working on that. And I guess with that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Thank you, Chris. So, as you've heard from Chris, from an engineering standpoint, this has been iterative and looking at a wide variety of scenarios. The key thing here, though, was looking at it from a more comprehensive or strategic view, focusing on these elements, which you see up on the slide here, in terms of the channel or floodplain expansion, which includes acquisition and removal of buildings, with the implementation of a public open space, as well as the stormwater retention elements. Again, we've mentioned a few of those specific projects, new and expanded culverts. The floodproofing element, so the Army Corps came in and actually took a fairly long amount of time to complete their study, which came out just earlier this year regarding floodproofing. And we have implemented, as part of the current budget year, some floodproofing opportunities and funding for businesses. Quite honestly, we put about $150,000 in there, expecting that there wouldn't be a lot of folks seeking to do it immediately, maybe a few, because the buildings had all been repaired when we came up with the budget. So we clearly expect to use all of those funds and continue that program on into the future. As well, community partnerships. Actually, I think I see Lori Lilly here from Howard Eco Works, as well as the READY program, where we've been working with community organizations that work in this area of flood mitigation in a variety of ways, including the Soak It Up campaign that Lori's organization's put forward, but READY, which is an organization that has brought human resources to this area going back many years, even before the last flood, to maintain the streams, inspect the streams, provide those reports to the county for action in terms of repairs. A couple things that I just want to hit on that I think are important. The models that you saw, and I think Chris might have mentioned, but I want to reinforce, we're using the 2016 water numbers, the volume. Why is that important to note? People have brought that up. Well, it's important to note because the volume was greater than in 2018. So the amount, the modeling accounts for a worse storm. Okay, so the improvements you see, they were applied to the 2018 storm, may actually be greater than what appears on these models. Further, I think it's important to note from a why and an urgency standpoint, this may come up in the Q&A, it's something that the National Weather Service brought up to us. Now, when we had the 2016 storm, they brought up the fact that this is a 1 in 1,000 year storm. Okay, and we learned through that process, and they've amended that comment back in 2016, saying, well, it's really not 1 in 1,000 years, it's more like 1 in 1,000 chance. And then, by the way, after 2018, they said this is not uncommon any longer, and it's not so much 1 in 1,000. They have not revised their models and how they call things, different types of storms. In fact, they've asked us to help them appeal to the federal government to allow them to redo their system. But the most important thing I think we've heard from them, and they brought it up as well in the meeting that we had last week, it was that Ellicott City, in the entire area of responsibility for the National Weather Service, their Sterling, Virginia operation, Ellicott City is the spot, the place, with the highest life safety risk for weather events in their entire area. That includes 44 counties in Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, including Baltimore City and D.C. So Ryan's still here. I think we are the first people they call when there's bad weather. And it's enough that Ryan loses sleep every night when it rains. Ryan and I have bumped into each other driving the channels, driving around observing the channels at night when it's raining hard. But the National Weather Service is paying attention to this spot because there's something about it. In the presentation, if you were there or watched it, they explain there's a lot of elements: topography, geology, obviously weather, changes in the weather that contribute to making this the riskiest spot in their area of operation. And so just wanted to share those. So the situation changed. Obviously, we have this comprehensive approach. The situation changed after 2018 because we were approached by several property owners, residents, people who own homes or commercial buildings, asking that we seriously consider acquiring their properties, which enable us to add this potential plan, part of the plan to the 5-year plan. And so, many folks have focused in on this part of the plan, the 10 buildings on Lower Main that are coming down. Now, Chris had mentioned and Tom had mentioned the 2 buildings in what we call Middle Main, which are Lapa Lapa and the brewery annex. Brewery annex is hard to say, but the annex to Ellicott Mills Brewery. That was discussed as part of the planning back in 2016. Obviously, this is the newest part of the plan. Most of the other elements of the plan, the 5-year plan, include all the things that have been discussed before, not only in the aftermath of the 2016 flood, but also in the 2011 flood as well. And so, when you look at these buildings, these are the 10 now. There are the 5 on top, 5 on the bottom. The 2 that seem to be connected, those are 2 separate buildings, and they're owned by one owner, but they're 2 separate buildings, as you can see, built at different times. But 4 of these buildings are not able to be repaired. They're beyond reasonable repair at this point, and under the current circumstance would have to come down. That's Kaplan's, and you saw a picture earlier in the presentation of Kaplan's. That was Kaplan's 2016. If you had a close-up of this, or if you saw it before it got boarded up, you look right into the river at Kaplan's, and some of that facade had fallen down subsequent to this picture. That building underwent about $1 million worth of reconstruction, and after 2016. And the ironic thing is, the building owner said proudly when the building was completed, "This will be the last building standing after the next flood." It had steel reinforced walls, thick poured concrete, and using new technology. I mean, the amount of energy that went into putting that building back together, again, was significant. It was damaged even more than the last flood. The other buildings that are beyond repair, the 2 next to them, sadly, they were about to reopen as businesses the weekend after the flood. But again, withstood significant damage. And the 4th one that is beyond repair is Discoveries. Again, similar to Kaplan's, if you look into the Discoveries, you're looking right into the river. The other two other buildings, so that's 4. The 2 buildings in the bottom left, you can see, Portales is circa 1920s, but it basically reconstructed after a fire in 2000. Shoemakers is a brand new building reconstructed after that fire, both under 20 years old, which leaves us with 3 buildings. And I don't mean to say anything bad about some of the other ones, but my favorite one being Hollow, where I spent a significant amount of time drinking many gallons of coffee over the last 15, 16 years. Great Pains, that has been demolished, not demolished, but damaged significantly over the years. It was very very little left in that building. In fact, I think I might have seen Len or Sherry here. There they are, and they tell the story after 2016 of saying, you know, we're going to restore the building back to its historic appearance. And they took down some of the stucco and realized there was nothing left underneath the building because it had been damaged previously and just rebuilt, the shell basically rebuilt. Phoenix, which is a couple of different constructions over time, as you can see, the brick and then the frame building were obviously significantly damaged, but fortunately is reopened. I was having a hamburger there last night. Burgers, for some reason, tasted a lot better last night than they did recently. Is Mark here? I apologize if you've seen him. But anyway, I'd recommend you go get a hamburger there while they're open. So that's sort of the inventory of the buildings that are standing. But one of the elements, and we'll talk a little bit later, but some of the elements of how are we going to restore, although they did leave off one building, but how are we going to maintain and preserve some of the historic nature? There are a lot of things that we're considering. Tea on the Tiber, as we've been discussing over the last few weeks, is a very strong potential and now a plan that is emerging that'll have that building move, right? It'll have to be, because of where it's constructed and how it's in the ground there, likely disassembled and reassembled, but that process has been discussed. And honestly, I'm excited about the likelihood that we can preserve that building as you see it in this picture here. And there's a group, and we'll talk about this in a minute or so, but a group of folks who have been, through executive order, commissioned to go through these buildings and identify elements that can be saved. Clearly, the Kaplan sign, is one example, but each of these buildings has elements that, if we can, where we can, we'll preserve some of those elements. So it's just a quick survey of where we are on Lower Main relative to this plan. And Mark, am I turning it over to you? Great.
Thank you. So what is the 5-year plan? So I'll just summarize the 5-year plan, as you can see on this slide. It's the Ellicott City property acquisition and removal, the Lower Main open space construction, which we'll talk about, the Ellicott Mills culvert expansion, which is a project that's going on right now because of the damage from the last storm. The Hudson Retention Facility, which is located at US 29 and 40 inside that interchange. And that project is in design right now. Quaker Mill Retention Facility off of Rogers Avenue, that project is in design. The 8600 Main Street culvert expansion, that project is also in design. And the two 10-foot culverts from Maryland Avenue to the Patapsco River. And that's under preliminary design right now. I think it's important to note on the right-hand part of this slide that what we're really, as designers, what we're trying to accomplish. So the first thing that we're trying to accomplish is to protect lives and mitigating the immediate risk to safety. The urgency, we're looking for projects where urgency is a significant portion of the plan and can be accomplished in a short amount of time. Another important feature is the plan has to be feasible and has to be constructible. There are many options out there of things that can be done that are essentially just ideas or lines on a piece of paper. But when we look at them through either the model or look at them through constructability, we really find out how good that plan really is. And then the last thing is cost effectiveness. And this plan by far, it produces the largest benefit for the dollar. So I want to step back and I want to show the model for July 30th, the water depths. These are the existing conditions for the July 30th storm. And I wanted to show this from the Patapsco River all the way to your right-hand side of the slide, all the way to Toll House Road. And this is the area, I call it the system. It's comprised of the west end, the middle part of Main Street, which is the Hudson Bend, and then the lower part of Main Street. And you can see with the scale, the water depths on the left-hand side of where the deepest water is. A lot of it is in the channel. You're seeing it in the channel. But the 6 to 8 feet and the 4 to 6 feet, especially on the residential end, and then also down on Lower Main, you can see that significant portions of Lower Main where the street is actually above 8 feet. Our 5-year plan, with the projects in the 5-year plan, this is the reduction, the mitigation improvements in the model. And I know that it may be difficult to see at this time, but we have significant reductions of water on the west part of Main Street, and then also we're showing on the lower part of, and then we control it in the midsection where the Hudson Bend is. We control that very well. And then on Lower Main, you can see that we have the deepest amount of water in the channel and have significant reductions on the street.
Mark, I just want to interrupt for one quick second, because these colors confound me and have for a while. The key thing is the purple, and you saw there was plenty of purple on the street in the before picture, and now the purple is in the channel. It's 8+ feet. Okay, understand in these storms it was plus, not 8. It was in many cases on the street 12 feet, 15 feet. We just aren't measuring it beyond that level. You can see, and if you've seen videos, and there are plenty of them around. Ron's got 600-700 hours of video on this, and you see the pictures where it is over the awnings on the first floor. The National Weather Service reported that Catonsville, so just a couple miles away, and that storm moved a mile or so west, we would have had water up to the top of the second, bottom of the third floor. Okay, same storm, same time, slightly to the east. Okay, so those depths would still be purple. Okay, so it's important to know, because we've had comments saying it only cuts it, by 30 or 40%. Well, it's well over 50% in a lot of places, and it makes a difference, because on the Lower Main, if you spend a lot of time there, and you know that a lot of those buildings on the lower end are actually raised. Street goes down, but the buildings stay up. The entrances, and historically the entrances used to be on the second floor. There was a walkway that went from about where Columbia Pike is all the way down to the train station, attaching most of the second floors. So that's it's something to note, that this is a scientific view, but a on the ground view gives you a probably more visual picture. Sorry, Chris, you probably can explain it better.
Well, one thing I wanted to add, it's not shown on the graphic, we're just showing depth here, the velocity reduction. In the existing condition with the 730 storm, we're looking at 11+ feet per second average velocity through that stretch of Lower Main. In the option that you see up on the screen, we're looking at about 4.5 average velocity. So the reduction in the velocity, the reduction in the force carrying debris associated with the destruction is significant as well. I thought that should be noted.
And that's a part of the entire strategy. The entire strategy, we recognize that there's still water on the street, and that some flooding, especially in events like the one we had on in July and then also in May, will put water on the street. And that's shown here. But the strategy is to reduce it as much as possible, and also to reduce the velocity. And as you pointed out, Chris, the issue with velocity and the velocity reduction, the issue with velocity is that it's the most damaging piece of the flood. It's what picks up the sidewalks, it's what picks up the cars and all the other debris and pushes it down the street, that causes even more damage and makes it, practically impossible to step outside your building if you happen to be in your building. It's impossible to step outside your building without fear of being swept away. And that was the case many times over in the last 2 storms. So the strategy there is to reduce velocity as much as it is to reduce the height. And John.
So before I move off this, the other point being in removing the buildings, it's not only keeping the water in the channel there were the major impediment, as you can see by the damage on the previous slides, are the buildings themselves, but also the impact on the north side of the street. A lot of the damage on the north side is function of velocity that is shooting across, being basically like a cannon being shot across the street at these pinch points, blowing through the fronts of buildings and then impacting the buildings on the other side. So the life safety is obviously the key driver in all this. There were people at risk on both sides of the street, the people in the buildings that were significantly damaged on the south side that we're discussing removing, but on the north side, similar situations because of the flow and velocity of water. I'll just spend a second on this slide because you're here, you obviously are aware of the community participation in the process and what's going to go forward. We had obviously lots of meetings between the flood work group, which started in around March of 2015 and met quite regularly since being formed back in March 2015, as well as the master planning process, which you're attending today. There'll be another session next month with greater participation in activities around design and input. I mentioned the Historic Structures Review Committee. This is by executive order creating the group of local folks involved in historic and historic preservation in general in the community. Historic Preservation Commission, they had a preliminary meeting which the county provided the plan for their information. And then as we go through the process, there is an application process that the county must follow that the Historic Preservation will monitor, manage, and will also include public input in that process. And then there's state and federal permitting processes, again, public parts of the process, and then the public hearing on the legislation, which is about the funding of the plan, which we've talked about being next Monday. Prepare to stay late. We'll be here for a bit, and so those are just a snapshot of some of it. The only thing I'd leave with before handing it back over to Tom is time. All right. So one of the comments or some of the comments have been around. Well, what's the urgency? What's the rush? Well, I'll be blunt. I don't see any rush here. We've been working on this since I filmed a chair going down Main Street in 2011 when my office was in Howard House. And Ron, who's one of the best landlords on the street, that was a dramatic event 7 years ago, almost to the day. That was just sort of the wake-up call. 2016 and 2018 were sirens, loud sirens of what's the potential to happen or continue happening here. The other part of it is, if you've watched some of the video, time is a critical element. The time it takes for the town to flood, the time it takes for a building to flood, the time it takes for somebody to make a decision whether to get out. So it's about time. And the urgency is what's driving a lot of what we're talking about here. And I think it's important to note that that's a key element of the plan. So Tom, you can talk a little bit more about what's next.
So as we, based on this information, the master plan team's charge is to really look at what are some of the next steps and how do we incorporate this 5-year strategy in the master plan process. The master plan goals or objectives that I shared earlier are still relevant. We'll still be building on those, but we'll be adding into that the life safety and protect lives objective. That's a very important one that has emerged from the county's process over the past the summer. So we'll be exploring and building upon this 5-year mitigation plan and understanding what are the opportunities and how does it impact the master plan in terms of the urban design and amenity enhancements, public space and open space, that these channel improvements are not just a utilitarian ditch or channel, but how do they become an amenity, much like we've looked at the Hudson Bend area. And we'll continue to look at them. What are some additional opportunities in Lower Main for streetscape and roadway improvements, widening sidewalks or so forth, getting more pedestrian area. And then we're also looking at debris management and some creative ways to deal with some of that, to keep some of the vehicles, dumpsters, and large tree debris from getting into the channels. So the concept for Hudson Bend is really still in play. We'll be continuing with that, but then we'll be really relooking at some of the strategies for West End, the Upper Main area, Lower Main, and the courthouse areas. The schedule, so we have a master plan advisory team meeting in mid-October. The next public workshop is in late October, and then there'll be online engagement opportunities after that, and then looking at preparing the draft plan for public review in early 2019. We'll be getting that to the county right before the holidays, give them a chance to review, and then we'll open it up to the public in early 2019. So with that.
And before we move on to the Q&A, I did want to recognize a couple other folks who have been part of the process. So Senator Gail Bates, I heard that she walked in the room. There she is in the back. And Delegate Ebersol. Gail Bates, Senator Bates, represents this district as well and has worked closely with Bob and me in the county on state support, as well as Delegate Ebersol, who, I'll be honest, he doesn't represent this area, but Delegate Ebersol has been an active part of the conversations about it in the last session as the co-chair of our delegation, and so appreciate you being here as well.
Well, as you can see, a ton of information that was thrown at you this evening. I know that you've heard a good deal of it. Some of it's new information. So our next step really is, question and answer period. And I know everybody's passionate here about Ellicott City. I'm just going to request that you curb your passion this evening and allow our team to be able to answer the questions that have been posed. Also, if you could stick to what you've heard this evening. If there's anything that you want to discuss that might be off topic, or if you have any other additional questions, I'm here. DPZ staff is here. So if I can't answer it, we will have somebody in the room who can. Also, let's be polite. Let people ask and answer questions. Please don't interrupt or applaud or boo or otherwise be rude. Also, this is not a time for making speeches. The point tonight is to get to questions and get answers. And let's also make sure that as many people as possible can ask questions tonight. So please don't dominate the microphone, as we're not setting time limits. Nevertheless, if we're running long, we'll ask the next person to be able to ask a question. And so we're going to try to stick as close as possible to our sunset this evening, which was scheduled at about 8 o'clock. So with that, if there's a speaker stand set up with a microphone, and when you come up, if you could please give your name, where you live, and if you represent an organization. So don't be shy.
Good evening. My name is Mike Smith. I live on College Ave in Ellicott City, and I have no financial interest in the outcome of these deliberations. On the basis of the testimony tonight, I'm confused. What was pointed out was that we have an 18-project solution that will deal with 425 acre-feet of water, but yet the 2016 event measured 800 acre-feet of water, which tells me that this plan doesn't work. This plan is predicated upon two really oblique 90-degree turns at the inlet and the outlet of the Hudson Bend, and roughly 20% of the facades in downtown Ellicott City would be raised through this plan. More buildings will have to come down, in fact, if you try to straighten out that Hudson Bend. And why aren't we looking at a southern alternative that would take the water and divert it completely away from Main Street and put it in the woods in a channel, a tunnel, that would intersect both with the Tiber branch and with the New Cut branch? Why haven't we looked at a southern alternative and get the water out of downtown Ellicott City? I'd love to hear an answer to that. Thank you.
I think that's most likely a question for
Mark
Chris,
or Chris,
or
yeah.
Mark.
Well, I guess in terms of the why, I'll leave some of that to Mark. I would note from the engineering perspective, There are a tremendous amount of engineering challenges and parameters that go into an option like that, and they may not all be sort of obvious from a layman's perspective. Most notably, what happens at the downstream end of such a thing with the elevations at the Patapsco River. As you recall from our 2017 presentation, there was some preliminary analysis done with options that included tunnels. The options that were presented, the 18 projects, were of a nature that's a little bit more immediate and could be constructed incrementally over time. You know, I would caution against any alternative, I guess, that offers simplicity, because there's nothing simple about what would be required to convey that water. There's a lot of details and engineering, like I said, engineering challenges that go into it. You know, exploration of that may occur, but.
So I'd like to address a significant point that I hope most people picked up on. I mentioned that we were trying to store 425 acre feet. And so there is very much more traveling during one of the storms. So one of the design parameters was to take the 100-year storm and bring it down to a 10-year storm value. And the reason being that most of the conveyance systems in the stream channel itself can't handle very much more than about a 10-year storm event, the water that comes out of a 10-year storm event. So the aspirational challenge that we spoke to McCormick Taylor about was to take the 100-year storm value of water and get it down to a 10-year storm value. Could we do that? And so that's where the 424 acre feet come from. That represents what we would have to store to get the 100-year storm down to a 10-year storm value. So that was the challenge, the original challenge. So the 18 projects that were proposed initially still left water on Main Street, on the lower part of Main Street, dried out some areas. However, it never really reduced the flooding on Lower Main Street, and so we had to look for a different solution for Lower Main Street, and that's where we are today. And I think that Chris brings up some good points about a tunnel solution, about an additional pipe. I mean, that was something that we looked at in the 2016 report, and but we did have some issues with that. We had some issues with its feasibility, constructability. We had issues with, timing. How long would it actually take? Cost. How much would this really be? It was probably 2 times more than the total solution that we were proposing. And the reliability of the tunnel we couldn't hang our hat on the reliability of the tunnel. So we might spend $80 million and it may not truly function the way that it was intended to in the model. So, and also the tunnel, if you were to look through the report, you'll see that it makes it look as though it drains out a portion of Lower Main Street. But that was with all the 18 other projects, as well as a second tunnel on the north side. So it's not comparing apples to apples at this point. But I think that in later meetings, we'll pull out what those elevations are, what that feasibility of those tunnels are, because we'll have to show the analysis that we did, that the reasons why we set it aside and looked at more efficient, more where we would know based on the modeling, we had more confidence, options where we had more confidence in some of the mitigation projects.
Hi, I'm Julia Sanger, 8080 Main Street. I happen to be one of the buildings that's on the north side of Lower Main, and definitely the target of a lot of these floating missiles. So I kind of have 2 questions. I promise they're short. The first question has to do with the estimates on the level of water down on Lower Main Street with this plan. I understand it slows down the velocity quite a bit and obviously cuts the depth in half. Is that assumption that that's still water coming from top down, or is that what happens when we're dumping, pardon my French, but a hell of a lot more water in the Patapsco and the Patapsco is coming up, or both?
Well, I would note the plan that you saw tonight, with the Hudson Bend involved, one of the things that will do is keep a lot of that water that was spilling out into Main Street upstream in the vicinity of Court Avenue and the brewery. It'll keep that in the channel. So a lot of what you're seeing under that option in Lower Main Street is still coming from the channel. It's coming from, even with the two culverts at Maryland Avenue, there is a constriction point.
Sure.
And there's also the fact the grade of Lower Main Street at that point becomes very flat.
Yeah.
So, those are two reasons why you're seeing that. So to answer your first question, a lot of that water is coming from the channel. There's always going to be localized water in the street during any rainfall event, but we do minimize the amount of water that comes down, both with the stormwater management options at H7 and Quaker Mill, but also the Hudson Bend being a real key to keeping that water in the channel through the brewery and Lot D area. But there is still a flatness. There is a constriction going underneath the railroad bed. And of course, there's the backwater elevation of the Patapsco. When the Patapsco comes up high, everything immediately above it slows down, and that's something we have no control over.
Sure. No, I understand that.
And Julie, were you asking about will the redirection of the water more directly into the Patapsco cause other flooding? Is that your question?
I guess sort of. I
Okay.
mean, my thought is, okay, great,
Yeah.
we get more water in
No,
the
it's
channels,
a-
it's flowing downhill, it's staying off the street, but then what happens to the Patapsco? I mean, it seems
Right.
logical that the Patapsco at some point will then rise and,
Sure.
hi.
No, it's a good point. It's a brilliant question because I've asked that. So, Mark, did you?
Thanks, John.
So the answer, that if I recall, and I'll let them correct me, is particularly with the additional culverts at the bottom of that would go under Maryland Avenue, connecting the channel, and the additional culvert, which right now we only have that one little box. What Mark showed in that picture, several slides, a bunch of slides ago, which shows every drop of water in the watershed goes through that area right by the B&O, adding the other channel, the other culverts, is further down river, right? So, in fact, with the implementation of that part of the plan as well, the water is downstream instead of upstream. But again, the challenge we have, like right now, and the fact that most of us are biting our fingernails during these last couple of days on the reports, and why a bunch of people were up at the church filling sandbags today, was a water rise from the Patapsco, right? And that, honestly, I don't know if you want to talk about that. That's not something that I think we have the ability to address as directly.
So that would be that's the perfect storm, where the Patapsco rises at the same time that we have a down, where we're getting water from upstream coming down. But the types of storms that we've experienced, we've had riverine flooding where the Patapsco has risen. And, Agnes was an example of that. We've had some other regional-wide storms that have caused the Patapsco to rise. And, that the storm drain right at the railroad bridge, water starts coming out of that, and then it slowly creeps up to Maryland Avenue, and then it slowly creeps up a little bit further. And the time involved, we have much more warning. We have a better warning system, better monitoring system. We know when those things are going to happen. They happen more slowly, and they're
Sure.
much more predictable.
Sure.
So, but then these flash floods, most of the 5-year plan addresses flash floods. It's something that we hadn't not addressed ever before. And so I'd like to consider the plan not only trying to do all of these mitigation systems, but they go hand in hand with a flood-proofing plan. They go hand in hand with whatever kind of early warning system we can get. and with a different type of safety plan to alert people, and maybe even create egress plans, so to get people away, or a protocol for what you do when there is a flash flood. So all of these things have to come together. They're all elements to the total mitigation plan. And it's unfortunate the only thing that we're talking about today is just, well, where are we going to store the water, and where's it going to go out? Where's it coming from? But these other elements are just as important. And but one other quick point, the Maryland Avenue culverts, and that's an important project because, like John did mention, every drop of water has to go out through that Maryland Avenue culvert between Main Street and the bridge abutment. And so it's, we need to find another way to get it out at the base, to get it at the base of the Tiber, to get it out of and redirected away from Main Street. And that's what the Maryland culverts will do.
Thank you. I'm sorry, one quick thing. The proposed plan, assuming it goes through, assuming everybody gets on board with it, do we have an estimated start date?
So
Thank you.
yeah, it's a two-part answer to that. And I'll start broadly and get down to the specific start times. Broadly, this plan has a phasing component to it, so there's a time element. And in the first phase to make this work most effectively is in starting in Lower Main, because whatever we do upstream, there has to be a place for the water to go, and we are increasing the capacity by expanding and deepening the channel at that point to receive more water from what would happen at the Hudson Bend, and then the upstream, which upstream involves both channel redirection, but increasing the size of culverts or removing culverts and daylighting, as well as retention, and retention uphill in a few different places. So the phasing is important, and so why I'm saying that first is because to start, we need to start on Lower Main, assuming a reasonable time frame and the various processes that I mentioned in the last slide that I spoke to, that we could begin. The goal is to begin to complete acquisition of appropriate properties on Lower Main by December, January, then to be able to affect removal or relocation by May. The goal really being before the summer rainy season, before the spring storms. The sooner the better, because as we know, these storms don't really care about the season anymore. So that's when, in terms of a start time. Now, Mark went through a whole list of things that have already started, and they've started upstream. Now, the point is, those projects will take a little bit longer just because they're more challenging engineering-wise. They just take more time to build. The plan for the Lower Main is the entirety of the project, including the construction of the public space, open space should be completed by the end of next calendar year. So from beginning to end, and again, that goes back to that timing point, right? That's the beginning of the beginning of the phasing. And in all these projects, the intent is 5 years that would be completed, if not entirely, but the vast majority of each of these projects would be completed within the 5-year period.
So I have the unenviable role as being kind of the traffic cop, and also to our answers, we've got, looks like about 6 people and 5 minutes left.
Okay, sorry.
So we're going to
We'll be
probably
briefer.
be going over a little bit.
We can afford to go over a little bit based on the schedule we have with the video and such. So we can probably push about 15 minutes or so. We'll get those folks. Beth, are you the last person? Or is there someone? Lori. Sorry, Lori, couldn't see you. So we'll end with Lori then.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. My name is Michael R. Bergdorf. I live at 3822 Spring Meadow Court in Dunlogan, up the street from Ellicott City. My two questions regard the plan and what might not have been considered in it. I was a bit disconcerted in reading the entire plan to see that we mention nature consistently throughout this plan, but there is no mention about what research or studies were done based on man-made runoff that would have come down through these channels. And I bring that up because obviously I want to make sure, one, that that's considered, and two, if we're going to do the nuclear option and blow up a bunch of buildings that we all love, I want to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a position also where there's going to be more development in the future and we're really just going to be cutting a leg off to build another arm. So I'd love if you could address just to what degree have we thought about this, and to what degree are we going to protect against potential future man-made flooding? Thank you.
So great question, and you live in a neighborhood that presents a good part of the issue, right? And so we have, and I think, Tom, you brought this up at the very beginning, a good part of the watershed is developed. At this point, about 90%, 85 to 90%, and a good portion of around 50 to 55, 56% was developed before stormwater requirements, minimal at best. About 70% or so, you'll have to forgive my percentages by maybe off by a couple, was built with minimal. So Mark and I were actually at a community meeting in St. John's, Dunlogan, the St. John's Community Association a couple of months ago. Honestly, Mark, I can't remember if it was pre-flood or post-flood, but post-flood, thank you. So there, yeah, okay, there you are. And that conversation, I think, was enlightening for us. And Mark, I'll recount some of what you said, is that we need a systemic approach to older neighborhoods with little to no stormwater management. In fact, we've been having a conversation is if that's something we can potentially enlist the Army Corps of Engineers to look at. They've offered to do studies, but their studies tend to take 3 to years or so. But we need a systemic approach there. And what we can do. And Lori Lilly's organization is ready, no pun intended, willing, able to work with communities to do some of those projects where it can be done very locally down in at the house level or neighborhood level to implement some water retention mitigation at that level. In terms of great, we're going to take buildings down, but more building can occur in the watershed. Well, the good news for now is there is a moratorium where nothing can be built for the next year. Permits can be issued, and building has come to a halt in the watershed, both in the Tiber, Hudson, as well as the Plumtree, 2 watersheds. The hope is, the expectation when I put forward that legislation is the county and the county council can work over that period to put into effect more stringent rules in terms of development in sensitive watersheds, of which we live in, which we're focused in on. There are other jurisdictions that have particular zone types or overlays, if you will. As an example, I think I've mentioned this before, as a sensitive watershed overlay that would keep whatever the underlying zoning is, but reduce density by half, 2/3, whatever. I mean, that's a simple example, but I think we need to have climate-sensitive zoning where it's appropriate, and there are places around the country that's starting to look at that. So some of the research you mentioned early is still somewhat new relative to how we can do that, but my hope is that where we know there are issues, we try and limit development to the greatest practical and legal way we can. And to be honest, I expect that there's a good chance that the county will be sued because the moratorium is in effect, and that'll test whether or not what we put forward can go forward. So I've completely ruined Val's request to not run on and on, but it's a good question you ask, and it has a lot of elements to it, but hopefully that provides an answer, and Tom's going to add to it.
And just to be real quick, we didn't cover this in the recap, but the draft plan that we were about to release does address some water quality recommendations, building on some of the efforts that are already underway, and we also had some recommendations that we'll be looking at in relation to the moratorium that's in place, but also some recommended changes to some of the stormwater management requirements related to development. So we didn't hit on those tonight, but they were in the draft, and we'll be developing those.
I'm going to really ruin this, even though I just got a text to shut up. And that is, there are potential other projects. No, it wasn't you. The text came from somebody else. There's a potential for some building in the historic district, right? One of the examples, which is part of the master plan, was Lot D. If something is built there, it will likely include stormwater management, flood management. There are parking structures around the country that have been built specifically for that purpose. I saw a couple in Boulder, Colorado that has suffered lots of flooding, as well as the courthouse. Huge opportunity at the courthouse because there is zero floodwater mitigation up there. It's a high cost to do something, just to do something up there that might not lend itself to a huge impact. The greater impact is certainly what we're talking about here, but part of the master plan process in October is going to be talking about the courthouse, since the courthouse is leaving, and what are we going to do with that great building up there, and how can we potentially do something that would contribute to mitigating flooding. So there is potential in doing some construction in the area to have a positive impact.
Hi, I'm Brian Bear. I live near Centennial Lane, and my question is about the new Maryland Avenue culverts that I guess was just spoken about quickly. Could you provide more details on how that's going to go under the railroad further downstream, I guess?
Well, those culverts, in terms of detail, I mean, they're modeled conceptually to say in terms of the size will convey this much water. Mm-hmm. The constructability aspect, absolutely very challenging. Anything going underground in Ellicott City because of the bedrock and the age of the surrounding structures brings with it a lot of challenge. So that'll need to be dealt with in the design process, and certainly the fact that there's a railroad involved with that lends itself an extra layer of coordination to the constructability as well. So absolutely in recognition, what you bring up is very valid concerns, but it will be part of the overall process for design.
It does have to go under the railroad, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
The railroad is definitely a significant impediment towards addressing that pinch point of getting the water from the Tiber to the Hudson, or to the Patapsco.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Melissa Metz. I live at 3101 Chatham Road, and I'm also an advisor to the Main Street Residents Community Association, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself. Thank you guys very much for all of this work that has gone into this. Really appreciate it. I have a couple questions, and I'll ask them all at once. One is some clarity on the timing. John, you just mentioned that the work at the end of Main Street, including widening and deepening the culvert, should be completed by the end of 2019. I think that there's some documents out there on the interwebs that suggest that this will happen in fiscal year 2022 or something like that. So if you could just clarify. Mm-hmm. And also regarding timing, we have heard that the lower main needs to be done before things can be done up top, but yet we know that things are going on up top with the retaining pond and the conveyance improvements, and especially the conveyance improvements, for instance, through the west end, that 8600 culvert. Is that going to be held up based on the work at Lower Main, or is that something that it's currently in process? So is that going to keep on going, or what part of the things upstream are actually going to be held up before the things downstream can happen? And I also know that at one of the flood work group meetings, it was mentioned that the culvert under Ellicott Mills Drive was going to be initially a smaller volume because of this issue, and then widened to a bigger volume. So, how is that sequence going to work? Second question is,
maybe we should start with those. Before we lose track.
These are really small.
Go ahead. Good. This is the last one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So were opportunities for other private property considered, for instance, West End Service? And then we would like a meeting about Valley Mead and Chatham flood stuff as well.
Okay, that's good. Good. So quick summary, timing? relative to what you're reading on the interwebs. I thought I was the only person who called them, so that's good, interwebs. The phasing, particularly the West End projects, which are already underway in Ellicott Mills Drive, small pipe, big pipe, so and then other private property considered for acquisition. So, Christy, you want to?
I wanted to note there's an important distinction between the two types of improvements, being the stormwater management, retention, as well as conveyance improvements. The retention actually reduces the quantity of water that goes downstream, so any of those can be done at any time, and it's an improvement for the whole watershed. The conveyance, there's definitely a consideration of which conveyances could potentially create a detrimental impact downstream if they're not sequenced properly. With regard to the improvements in the West End conveyance, the 8,600 culverts, in looking at our models, improving the conveyance up in that does not have a significant effect on what's happening in Lower Main. There are other improvements closer, like the Hudson Bend, for example, that could impact if not sequenced. So that's absolutely considered in terms of the order in which things are done, and will be considered. But at least in terms of any of the Hudson 7, Quaker Mill, those stormwater projects, those can go at any time without worrying about that.
I think it's worth noting, and correct me if I heard it wrong previously, and that is, but because these are the projects that have been discussed before and that we're moving forward because they're in the current budget year, et cetera, but because we're now considering this Lower Main part of the project, we actually have additional opportunity, particularly by West End Auto and 8600, to do something a little bit different, which would have increased the capacity and flow, right? So originally there was a conversation about doubling the size of the pipe, but now, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, and Mark, if this is something you said or I got wrong, and that is even could become a bridge instead of a pipe. And then tied into what I'm saying here is to your third question about other properties considered. Yeah, in fact, particularly West End Auto, we had actually had conversations with them. Gosh, it's at least the beginning of the year, January, February, March time frame, about opportunities if they were willing to sell some of their property, and so yeah, they've been engaged in those conversations, and they are part of the West End solution, among other properties, residential properties on the West End. So yes, there are in the report 19 proposed properties. We talked about the 10 on Lower Main, 2 in the Middle Lane, and then there are 7 residences in other parts. I don't know if we count the West End property because we're not acquiring a building; it's just some land in front of their building. So those are the other elements. So then the second part of your question was about the West End improvements. I think we answered part of it, but Ellicott Mills Drive, Mark, can you talk about how it's small to start and then gets bigger?
Well, it is true that so Ellicott Mills Drive was just a 9-foot diameter pipe, and so that's the way it had functioned before, and that's the amount of water that it allowed to go through behind the wine bin and ultimately through Court Avenue and, then through a couple 90-degree turns into Lot D. So because that's in the middle of the system, and at the time that it occurred, it was in the middle of the system, so what were we going to do? Well, we designed for the 100-year storm, so it would pass, a lot of water. But realizing that that was going to be completed before anything else, we designed it to constrict water so that it would only it would still function as a 9-foot diameter pipe until we can finish the Hudson Bend or until we could go to Lower Main and make improvements there. So that's how we're dealing with that. And then as we finish those downstream projects, then we'll determine how much we could actually open up the Ellicott Mills culvert, and then do that. So it's almost like there's going to be knockouts that you can just knock out. That's an oversimplification, but really that's essentially what it is. They knock them out and they can make it bigger. And something you said just brought to mind about the Maryland Avenue culverts, and which we did not really hit on, is that you know, for the Maryland Avenue culverts, although that any boring project is going to be difficult to do because of all the older infrastructure and the elevations and dealing with CSX, everything's got to cross underneath of the CSX tracks. But it's a much shorter run, and I think that we're a lot more confident. And you know, if we put the dollars into those culverts, that the return that we get from having them in there, I think that we can more easily see that. And so I just wanted to bring that up because the gentleman before had mentioned the difficulties in it. No doubt there's going to be difficulties in anything that we do underground. But I think that that's a much shorter run, and so, you know, I think the expectation is that it will be incrementally easier.
Thank you guys so much.
She asked my question.
It was nice of you to stay there to just let us know that.
There was no other way to get out.
Thank you, Beth.
I'm Lori Lilly. I live in Woodstock. I'm a member of the flood work group. I was very interested in wondering if the master plan team is going to put this 5-year plan into the context of a much longer flood mitigation plan, say like 20 years, because we know that at the end of this 5 years, there's still more work to be done. There's going to be more projects, retention and conveyance improvements to improve other areas of the watershed. In the west end, now the new cut is all tore up, and there needs to be a lot of improvements there. So I'm wondering about that. Also, along those longer-term thinking lines about the flood work group itself, which is not a permanent organizational structure. We are not able to add new members or replace members, and there needs to be a long-term advisory body for implementing this long-term flood mitigation plan, because 5 years it's just not enough, and I want to know what's going to happen after that.
Tom, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, the master plan is going to be looking beyond the 5 years. It's going to be, you know, short, medium, and long-term recommendations and goals. So we'll be looking at projects and recommendations beyond the 5-year strategy. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Mark. For flood mitigation, yes. Yes.
Could I comment on the general plan? Yeah. So one of the things that the Department of Planning and Zoning is going to be doing, you know, every 10 years or so, we update the general plan, which is the general guide for Howard County. I think as a result of this discussion, that's probably going to elevate the kind of conversation that we have as part of the general plan with a focus towards sustainability. And so I think that there are multiple opportunities to begin to address the kinds of questions that you posed.
And on your last point, Lori, about an advisory body, I've had those conversations with the executive. He's pointed out that a more permanent organization or entity would be appropriate. So I think it's just a function of finding the right way to administer that, because there are a couple of permutations on that. So those are conversations. I think the idea was to allow this part of the process to come to a sort of a natural conclusion, and then to follow it up with another entity that exceeds a short time frame. And we sort of extended it beyond its initial plan for obvious reasons. But those conversations are already taking place. All right, sir, you're going to get the last word, even though Lori was supposed to, but we'll give it to you.
Appreciate it. My name is Will Cleveland. I live in Oella, and I was curious if you guys, in your consideration of options, considered any option that includes raising the new Roger Carter building, the Burgess Mill developments, and the retirement home.
I think the simple answer to that is no. Right.
And why not?
Well, with Burgess Mills, which was Burgess Mills 2, which is under construction, raising it would it just doesn't necessarily make sense at the stage where we're, and Mark, you can probably speak to it better. Those areas had buildings on them previously that had little to no flood mitigation, and the replacements of those buildings included flood mitigation. I will tell you, though, there is a limitation that we try to fight, and actually, I guess, I don't know, I think Delegate Flanagan is here still. You still, I don't know if he... Oh, he's behind. Oh, he's right. So he had brought legislation to the state to allow the county to change the rules for redevelopment to require an entirety of a property to be brought up to the latest codes. And unfortunately, that while it passed almost unanimously through the House, it didn't get voted on in the Senate. So there are options for that sort of thing, but no, those options were not discussed. Mark, did you want to add anything?
No, I think actually that covers it. In that there is a limitation. The stormwater management, I think through the, however, I think through the modeling and also through some of the projects and conveyances that we're looking at, I think, for example, some of the newer regs, which these projects were designed by, don't necessarily account for the full. For all the storms that we are counting for now in this area. And but I think that we're looking at them as existing conditions right now. And so in some fashion, they're going to be incorporated into all the modeling that we're doing. So their detrimental effect should be mitigated for that reason alone.
It just appeared to me that in the appendices of the H&H study that none of that development was included in the model. So I was just wondering, first of all, why is that the case? Why was it not included? At least that's what appears to be in the appendices of the study.
Relative to the study that was performed after 2016, we were using what was the up-to-date county land use model. So it didn't necessarily incorporate development that may have been in the process of being approved at that time. It's also worth noting, too, relative to looking at things on a watershed-wide scale like that, the impact of an individual development on the values falls within the relative error quite closely, which is to say, one few acres, parcels within a few square miles, although it does increase the amount of runoff if it's not managed, doesn't move the needle very much. And when we're looking at the broad strokes, the thousands of CFS.
That would kind of run counter to your Lot F argument, wouldn't it?
How so?
Well, you kind of...
Sort of. This is getting into a level of detail that I think, when we're running out of time, so you're welcome to continue the conversation, Chris, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Since you have a little bit more. Appreciate you coming across the river, and I know you probably, as an OL person, spent a lot of time here in Ellicott City, and we do have a lot of folks that from Catonsville, OL, and our friends on the other side that do care as deeply about our community as we do. So with that, I know, folks, we ran a little bit later than we planned, but we try to wrap it up as quickly as possible. Thank you very much. I will remind you that there'll be a date. I think we do have a date. October 25th is the current schedule. So if you want to put pencil in a date for the next planning session, a master planning session, it's October 25th. A location will be determined. September 17th, that's Monday. If you want to come and testify specifically on the legislation. If you can't make it, the council is ready, willing, able, and interested in your testimony. Council mail at howardcountymd.gov. You can mail it in. It has the same impact as if you're here, and so we appreciate if you do that. But thank you again all for coming out tonight, and have a good evening.